So you're there in Daniel chapter 1. And I wanted to start a series. I know that we usually do our chapter by chapter on Wednesday, but I actually I really love the book of Daniel. And so I didn't want to wait until we got done with Matthew to jump into this. So I'm not going to be super strict with this. Meaning we're going to go chapter by chapter through the book of Daniel. But, there may be a Sunday afternoon where I just really want to preach on something else, like something that's really like pertinent or like timely or something like that. And we'll just kind of shift that to the next week or whatever. So it's not like the Wednesday where it's just like every time it's a chapter by chapter. But we will eventually get through the book of Daniel. But I wanted to go through it. And so obviously we'll be getting into some end times prophecy, but there's a lot of fun stories. That's why I probably like Daniel so much, because there's some of the most iconic stories in the Bible in it, but it also has like future events and just prophecies and things that would apply to us in that passage. So, but basically Daniel 1 is kind of an introduction to the book and just kind of setting the stage as far as who Daniel is, what time period you're dealing with. And so you see there in verse 1 where it says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem, and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God." So we see here that Nebuchadnezzar came and besieged Jerusalem in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. And I kind of want to just talk about that for a second. Go to 2 Chronicles chapter 36, because I kind of want you to see where we're dealing with here. Because what it's going to really come down to is that Daniel is taken captive at the beginning of the 70-year captivity that was promised to happen on Judah for their sins. And then he's going to be there for that whole entire captivity. Okay? And so, things feels weird. Anyway, 2 Chronicles chapter 36. And this gets confusing when you look at the end here, when you deal with Josiah dies and then his son's taking over. Because basically you have Jehoahaz, who reigns for 3 months, then Jehoiakim takes over for 11 years, and then Jehoiakim reigns for 3 months, and then they put in Zedekiah for another, so it's like this whole, and then there's this back and forth with Babylon. So I want to keep it really simple with you here as far as what's going on. 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and verse 5, it says, "Jehoiakim was 25 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 11 years in Jerusalem, and he did that which was evil in the sight of his God. Against him came up Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and bound him in fetters to carry him to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar also carried of the vessels of the house of the Lord to Babylon and put them in his temple at Babylon." Sound familiar? So that's exactly how Daniel starts off. But Daniel tells you a little bit of information as far as when Nebuchadnezzar came into Jerusalem to besiege it. And so what you see there is that it was into the 3rd year of Jehoiakim's reign when Nebuchadnezzar came in to besiege it, but he didn't carry him out until it was his 11th year of reign. Does that make sense? So what you have there is you have 8 years of him besieging Jerusalem until he actually takes him out captive, and he takes these people. So Daniel is, when Jehoiakim's taken captive, that's when Daniel's taken captive. Okay, and Daniel's a child when he's a, it says the children, so they're children. I don't know how old he was, but obviously he was, he could be like 10, 11, 12. I don't think he was a baby, but I mean, he was a child. But so we see that that's when Daniel is coming into this captivity. And then he's going to be there until the very end of the captivity, because notice in 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and verse 20, because I want to spare you all the stuff with Zedekiah and like the whole thing with the rebellion and, the putting out of his eyes and all that. There's a lot of other information in there as far as this other period of time before. So basically with Jehoiakim, when he's taken captive, he takes some of the vessels of the house of the Lord, and then when Zedekiah is put into reign and he basically betrays Nebuchadnezzar, they come in and they burn the house of God to the ground and take everything out of it and take the rest of the stuff with them. Okay, So when Jehoiakim's taken captive and Daniel's taken captive, that's before they come and burn the house of God to the ground. Okay, and so, but in 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and verse 20, it says, "And them that had escaped from the sword carried he away to Babylon, where they were servants to him and his sons until the reign of the king of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed her Sabbaths. For as long as she lay desolate, she kept the Sabbath, to fulfill 60 years. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord spoken by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and put it also in writing, saying, Thus saith Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth hath the Lord God of heaven given me, and he hath charged me to build him an house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Who is there among you of all his people? The Lord his God be with him, and let him go up." So when you go to Daniel chapter 1, how's it start? It starts off with the fact that he's taken captive with Jehoiakim. And then notice in verse 21, "And Daniel continued even unto the first year of King Cyrus." Now why is that important? Because in the first year of King Cyrus, he made that proclamation. So that's the end of the 70-year period. Okay? So that's 70 years, and for sake of time, I'm not going to, we'll get into that maybe more when we get into chapter 9, about the significance of the 70 years and what that represented and all that. But I just kind of want to give you a quick overview. We'll get into the stuff about Daniel with the prince of the eunuchs and everything, but just an overview of the book of Daniel. So Daniel is chronological, meaning it follows a chronological order in time from Daniel 1 to Daniel 6. Okay, so you'll see Nebuchadnezzar's mentioned, and then Belshazzar, who's, I believe, a grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, and then you have Darius, the Mede, and then Cyrus comes in. Okay, so you have that progression, and then it turns back. When you get to chapter 7, you're back to Belshazzar. Okay, and then it goes from Belshazzar back to Cyrus again. Okay, so basically what you see is from chapter 1 to chapter 6, clear chronological order of events of Daniel's life, and then it comes back and it's chronological again from 7 to 12. Okay, and that's clearly seen by what king is reigning when you look at these chapters. Okay, but if you think about Daniel and the fact that Daniel is the book of prophecy, if you're going to look at it in the Old Testament, if you were going to pick a book that dealt with end times prophecy, what book would you pick? Daniel. Most people are going to pick Daniel. I guess you could pick Isaiah, because Isaiah has a lot of prophecy when it comes to the first coming and second coming. But by and large, if you're going to look at end times prophecy, you're going to look at the book of Daniel. Now, you see clearly from Daniel that 1 to 6 chronological kicks back, and then 7 to 12 chronological. That's the way Revelation works. So no marvel that when you look at Revelation, chapter 1 to chapter 11, all chronological, and then it comes back in chapter 12, going all the way back to the birth of Christ, and then going through the information again to chapter 22, completely down the center. Okay, so you say, well, Revelation, how do you know it cuts in half? Well, because it's not unprecedented that a book of prophecy would do that. And so, but there's something else too to notice when you're looking at Daniel, and you may have noticed this when you're reading, that there's certain chapters that kind of seem to go together as far as what's being said in it or the content. And the ones that you can see very clearly is chapter 2 and chapter 7. When you're dealing with that image that Nebuchadnezzar dreams about, and you see this progression of kingdoms, and in chapter 7 you have these beasts that come out of the sea, that's a progression of kingdoms. You could look at chapter 3 and 6, you have the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that are in the fiery furnace, and they're saved from that. And then in chapter 6 you have Daniel that's thrown into the den of lions, and he's saved from that. You could look at chapter 4 and chapter 5 where you see kings being humbled, right? King Nebuchadnezzar being humbled in chapter 4, and then Belshazzar is being humbled and actually killed in chapter 5. You could also see that chapter 8 and 11 are clearly paralleled. And I'm kind of saying this off the cuff because we're going to get to it, okay? So you can just take my word for it right now, but you'll see it later when we get to those chapters that they're very much paralleled. And then chapter 9 and chapter 10 are like that. Chapter 1, chapter 12 are kind of like the introduction and conclusion. So it's very interesting. You may not have noticed that, but you think of like there was something very similar about the burning fiery furnace and the den of lions, as far as just what's being stated there, how God will save out of tribulation. And so Daniel is definitely a very interesting book. And we see here that Daniel and his friends were children when they came into Babylon. Go to Daniel chapter 1 and verse 3. Daniel chapter 1 and verse 3, it says, "And the king spake unto Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel, and of the king's seed, and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, but well favored and skillful in all wisdom and cunning and knowledge and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, in whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years, that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. Now among these were of the children of Judah Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave names. For he gave unto Daniel the name of Belteshazzar, and to Hananiah of Shadrach, and to Mishael of Meshach, and to Azariah of Abednego." So we see that they're children. It says, find children in whom. And even later on it talks about the 4 children, of Daniel. And it's interesting because Daniel, we always think of his name Daniel. We don't think of Belteshazzar, right? But when you think of his 3 friends, who do you think of? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? You don't think of, and you even have to think about it. You're like Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, right? Now, Mishael and Azariah are kind of easy because they both start with the same letter, but Hananiah is a little different, right? When you think of Shadrach. But it's just funny how you because that's what's being mentioned in the books, right? When you look at chapter 3, it's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It doesn't use their other names, right? So, but what I see here is that why did he want to bring in children? Because he wanted to assimilate. He wanted to assimilate the children of Israel, or the children of Judah, into the kingdom of Babylon. And notice that he wants smart people. He wants intelligent children. But then he says, who we can teach the tongue of the Chaldeans. Okay? And then he changed their names. Okay, so you can see how they're trying to assimilate these children into their society to basically just make them Babylonian. And so whenever a kingdom would take over other countries and stuff like that, that's what they're trying to do, is basically just make them, Chaldeans. And to where you don't have this idea of a rebellion or them splitting off, because they're pretty much one of them now. Okay, that's the idea as far as what they're trying to do here. This kind of gives you a little clue, because there's been so many things said about why Daniel did not want to eat the king's meat. Okay, if you go into it with that mindset that what they're trying to do with the children is assimilate them into their society, you can maybe understand why Daniel did not want to eat the king's meat. And I'm going to get into some of the verses with that, but notice in verse 8 of chapter 1, it says, "But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself." And so I've heard so many sermons on this. I've heard people preach about this as far as what this is talking about. But the first thing that you see here is that Daniel purposed in his heart that he wouldn't do this. And that's how everything, if you're going to fight a battle when it comes to a spiritual battle, you have to have it purposed in your heart first. In Psalm 119 and verse 11, it says, "Thy word have I hid in mine heart, that I might not sin against thee." And one big thing about memorizing the Bible is having that in your heart, so that when you come to a situation where you might sin, you're ready. You have those words in your heart to where it's going to be harder for you to get into that sin. You think of like fleeing fornication, right? Flee fornication, and it talks about the fact of 23,000 people died in one day because of fornication. If you have that in your heart, and then you're in a situation where you could be tempted to commit fornication, you're going to be maybe less likely to do it, because you've already purposed in your heart and you said, "I'm not going to do it." But if you go into a situation saying, well, we'll see how it goes. If you go into a situation with that attitude, you're going to do the latter. You're going to do the work. You're going to do what's wrong because your flesh wants to do what's wrong. And if you don't go into it with the attitude, I'm not going to do this, this is not what I'm going to do, then if you go into it just saying, well, we'll see how it feels, see how if I want to do it or not. No, you're going to want to do it. You're going to want to do wrong. You're going to want to sin. And so you have the purpose in your heart. Now, when it comes to this, defiling himself with the king's meat, or the portion of the king's meat, go to Proverbs chapter 23. So I kind of want to explain why I believe he's not wanting to eat it. It could be that, it's sacrificed unto idols, and, it's something to where he doesn't want people to think. It's kind of like for the conscience sake. You think of 1 Corinthians talks about that a lot, where you can eat whatever you want, but, if someone sees you eating something sacrificed unto idols, they're going to think that you are eating it sacrificed unto idols, right? Does it make sense? Like, they think that you're doing it because of the idol and not just because you want nourishment, right? And so it could be because of that, but it doesn't mention that, okay? It doesn't mention where this meat came from. Now, obviously, it mentioned before that they took all the stuff from the house of God and put it into the house of his God. So we know that these are idolaters. They're believing in a false god. But notice what it says in Proverbs 23 and verse 1. It says, when thou sittest to eat with a ruler, consider diligently what is before thee, and put a knife to thy throat if thou be a man given to appetite. Be not desirous of his dainties, for they are deceitful meat. So what I believe is going on here with Daniel is the fact that he doesn't want to be tempted to basically be a part of Babylon. And if someone's trying to assimilate you into society, and you can be tempted, like meaning that you can be drawn into it. Does that make sense? Because it's a very luxurious society with riches. I mean, he's being brought into a position of high authority, and they're training him up to be in a position of high authority to where he'll have power and money and honor and all this stuff. And basically what he's doing is he's putting a stumbling block to where he won't be given to it. Okay? So he's basically saying, I don't want to even be tempted or given to appetite. Meaning it's not necessarily wrong to eat it, but if you eat it, you can end up wanting it really bad. Okay? Being tempted to be like, I want this lifestyle. Nuts to God. Okay? I like the Babylonian lifestyle. And so he's basically putting the brakes on it and saying, I don't want to even eat of this meat because I don't want to be given to the appetite. I don't want to be, and notice it says, be not desirous of his dainties. And so if you eat something, if you're doing something, you may end up being addicted to it or given to it. It's kind of like being given to wine, right? We're talking about wine being grape juice and something of a luxurious commodity. And if you're drinking it all the time, you can end up turning to be given to it, meaning that you're addicted to it now, and you have to have it. And Daniel, I believe, is putting himself into a situation where he's not even eating it to where he'd even be given to appetite about it. Okay? Notice that as you keep reading there in verse 4 of Proverbs 23, it says, labor not to be rich, cease from thine own wisdom. Wilt thou set thine eyes upon that which is not? For riches certainly make themselves wings. They fly away as an eagle toward heaven. Eat thou not the bread of him that hath an evil eye, neither desire thou his dainty meats. For as he thinketh in his heart, so is he. Eat and drink, saith he to thee, but his heart is not with thee. The morsel which thou hast eaten shalt thou vomit up, and lose thy sweet words. And so you got to understand that Daniel, the heart of Daniel here. Daniel loves the Lord, and he's going into this society, and he's not necessarily, like, he realizes he has to be in this society. That's what Jeremiah preaches. Like, you're going to go in there, and you're going to have houses, you're going to have families, you're going to have to do what you got to do to live and survive there. But you're not supposed to forget your God. And Daniel, I believe, is basically setting up this standard to where he doesn't get tempted into the society of the Babylonians, into the society of the Chaldeans, by eating what they eat and being given to appetite. And when it comes to food and all that stuff, that's a very good picture of the world when it comes to the things and the material things of this world. When you start tasting it, you just want more of it. And I believe this is showing us that, hey, he's not even wanting to taste. He doesn't want to eat it at all to where he won't be given to it. Okay? And that goes for anything. If you have a problem with some kind of, you have a vice or something like that, you need to just cut it off completely. You start, nibbling on it, then it's just going to basically, you're just going to start taking it all in. And so I believe that's what we're dealing with here is the fact that, hey, he's purposed in his heart that he might not defile himself. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that eating it defiles himself, but if you desire it and you're given to it, that would be sin. Does that make sense? It's kind of like money's not evil, but the love of money is the root of all evil. Does that make sense? Money answereth all things. We all have to have money to live, but if you love money, that's when it's evil, right? And it's not necessarily bad to have dainties or to have good meat, but if you're given to it and you're desirous of those things, that's where it turns into sin. And so Daniel is purposing in his heart. And notice that also there's a lot of things in this verse, in verse 8. So he purposes in his heart, so he's kind of setting himself up to say, I'm not going to do it. So he's basically saying, I'm not going to eat this, right? And then I kind of explained to you why he wouldn't want to eat it. But then look, it says, therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. So notice his attitude. He's not saying, bless God, I'm not eating this meat. And if you put it before me, I'm going to spit it out. That's not the way he approached it. He requested. And he gave basically an opportunity and said, hey, let me prove you. And we'll get to that with the pulse. But Proverbs 15, in verse 1, it says, a soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. You need to learn, especially if you're dealing with a situation. You think about, like, if you're dealing with your boss at work or something like that, and say, hey, I can't do this because of religious reasons, right? Let's say your company is like, saying, hey, we're doing this meeting or whatever, and it's going to be in this bar, and there's going to be all this drinking. You're like, I can't do that. I need to stay out of that situation. I don't want that appearance of evil on me and stuff like that. But you don't go in there and be like, bless God, you wicked reprobate. Like, why are you telling me to go do this, okay? Like, you don't go into it like that. You just say, listen, I'm a Christian, and, the Bible says this about alcohol. It says this about abstaining from the appearance of evil. And I believe it would be sin for me to go in there and be around it, even let alone, I'm not going to drink it, but I don't want to even be around it. It says not even to look on it when it's red, when to give it the cover of the cup, and you kind of give them some reasons, but you're being very meek and gentle about how you're explaining it. In the end, you're going to stick to your guns. Okay, in the end, you're going to say, listen, I'm not going. So let the chips fall where they may. Does that make sense? So you purposed in your heart saying, I'm not going to do this, but how do you ask? How do you try? Do you go in there guns a-blazing? It's just like, this ain't happening, and you just start like demanding things to your boss. It's like, listen, you're going to get fired just for doing that. It had nothing to do with what the problem was. So you got to go in, soft answer turneth away wrath. And usually if you explain it that way and you give them reasons, they're going to be understanding of it. And especially if you're a good worker to begin with, they're going to say, hey, we don't want to lose you over something stupid like this, right? But also in Proverbs 18:23, it says, the poor useth entreaties, but the rich answereth roughly. What position is Daniel in right now, right? Is he in a position of authority where he can really start barking orders? No, when you're in a position where you're not the boss, you're not the master of the situation, listen, the boss can bark orders and speak roughly, right? Because he has that authority and he can, speak as roughly as he wants, or a rich person because they don't need anything, right? They're not dependent on anything. But someone that's poor is dependent, right? They're either dependent on God, or in the case of West Virginia and the welfare state that we live in, they're dependent on the government, right? But all it says is that the poor has to use entreaties, whereas the rich can speak roughly. And let's just be honest, most of us aren't like billionaires running Fortune 500 companies, so all of us are answering to somebody. Does that make sense? I don't care if you own a business, you're answering to the customer that you're providing the service for, right? And so you're going to use entreaties, you're going to speak softly or gently because you need their business, or you need, that job or whatever. And so when Daniel comes to the prince of the eunuchs, or to Melzar, who was under the prince of the eunuchs, he doesn't just bark orders at him. He's basically coming up to him softly. But I believe that if this wouldn't have worked out, or if Melzar said, no, I'm not even giving you an opportunity, you have to eat it, I believe Daniel would have stuck to his guns. And later on in the book of Daniel, we see that happens, meaning that he sticks to his guns. And so that's what I see there with the dainty meats and all that. I think it's just the fact of Daniel wanting to keep himself separate and basically putting a governor on his appetite. Okay. Now in verse 9, it tells us what Daniel's plan is as far as what he is going to eat and all that. Now in verse 9 it says, Now God had brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink, for why should he see your faces worse liking than the children which are of your sword? Then shall ye make me endanger my head to the king. So first of all, we see here that when he says, he requests to him, Melzar is not exactly saying, he's not saying, no, you're going to eat it. He's basically saying, he liked him, right? And God put him in favor with all these people, meaning that they liked Daniel. And so when he made this request, Melzar, I think if he was the master or if he was king, he would have been like, oh, okay, that's fine. But he was afraid for his own sake, meaning that if the whole point of them eating this meat was to make them really healthy and kind of, imagine you're coming out of being besieged and probably malnourished and anemic, or something like that. And basically, he's giving them 3 years to basically just nourish up, get healthy, and be at your top of your game. And then they're going to present you before the king. And this Melzar is basically saying, hey, if I bring you before the king and you're malnourished, it's going to look really bad on me, because that was my job, right? His whole job was to keep them healthy and feed them and all this other stuff, right? And so that's his worry. But then Daniel brings up this proposition. It says in verse 11, it says, Then said Daniel to Melzar, whom the prince of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Prove thy servants, I beseech thee, 10 days. And let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before thee, in the countenance of the children that eat the portion of the king's meat, and as thou seest, deal with thy servants. So he's basically putting up this proposition, say, give us pulse and water, and then these other servants, let them eat the meat, and then just basically see who looks better. Okay, that's basically what he's saying, after 10 days. Now, what is pulse? Okay, well, pulse is basically, and I just, looked up what pulse was, but pulses are basically edible seed that grows in a pod. Okay, so pulses include like beans, peas, lentils. You can think of this like baked beans, like red, green, yellow, brown lentils, chickpeas, and so everybody that loves hummus, you could eat hummus on this diet, right? I don't know what else they put in there, right? Is it just chickpeas? They just mash up chickpeas and put it in a bowl? No? Okay. I'm not a big hummus fan. That's why I'm giving her a hard time, but everybody here loves hummus, Anyway, make hummus, not walls, right? Wasn't that in the film, right? So anyway, so chickpeas. I do know that chickpeas is in hummus, though, right? Okay, I got that right. So, but anyway, there's peas, beans. It's pretty much lentils, beans, right? Stuff like that. So all my favorite things, right? Not really. So, so that's basically what you're dealing with, and so basically, God does. I believe He performs a miracle here to where they actually get healthier here, and this is where people are going to take this off the rails and be like, "See, vegan diet is the diet to go with, and that's that's the diet of champions. Look at Daniel, the Daniel diet, and and so." What you got to understand is that throughout the book of Daniel, you're dealing with some miracles here, right? We're going to get to the burning fiery furnace. You're going to try to explain that one naturally. I can explain the den of lions naturally. There's a lot of things here. How about, Nebuchadnezzar being turning into an animal, and all this stuff. Anyway, so all that to say is that you got to understand that God is putting him in favor. And I believe that's why they end up having fairer flesh, because of why Daniel's doing it. Okay, Daniel's not just doing this to lose weight. It's not just his way of like getting in shape. The whole reason he's doing this is so that he doesn't have to eat the king's meat. Okay, in verse 14 it says, "So he consented to them in this matter, and proved them 10 days. And at the end of 10 days their countenances appeared fairer and fatter in flesh than all the children which did eat the portion of the king's meat. Thus Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink, and gave them pulse." I guarantee those other children were like, "What'd you do? You took away all our good food." I don't know why I read this, but I'm always laughing because they're just like looking at him like, "Thanks, guys, thanks." Now we got pulse and water to drink. So, but all that to say is that it worked out. God, I believe performed a miracle there. Because, when you're dealing with vegans, and listen, if you want to be a vegan, that's fine. I believe you're being abusive to your children if you're a vegan and you're breastfeeding, because you're missing a lot of nutrients. But if you want to be a vegan to yourself, that's fine. But I think you're going to be malnourished. And they're like, "Oh, you can get protein from beans." Yeah, well, that's what this is here. And there is protein in that, but good night, how many beans are you going to eat? Now look up how many beans you got to eat to get the daily protein you're supposed to have. Listen, I don't like beans anyway. This would be rough in general. This would be rough for me to just take a spoonful of beans just to be healthy, okay, and have something on the side there. I'll eat my broccoli, but keep your beans. Maybe I'll have chickpeas if you have a little hummus, but you got to put garlic in that beast. None of this just straight up hummus. So anyway, all that to say is that, this whole idea of being vegan and using passages like this. You see, this is where people will go into the Bible and you can literally find anything you want. I've heard of people saying, well, in Isaiah it talks about when you kill an offering, it's as if you killed a man, and when you did this, it's as if you chopped off a dog's head. You're like, see, you shouldn't kill animals. It's like killing a person. And I've heard people use that. And I think, Brother Joseph, I think you're the one that told me that one time, and I've heard other people use it, where they try to use that to say, well, we should never kill animals, right? And it's like talking about the fact that their sacrifices are detestable to him because they're wicked, right? Because of their wickedness, God will not recognize their sacrifices. And he's saying that you being a wicked person and doing a sacrifice is as if you killed a man. That's what the Bible's saying. But they'll take that so far out of context and say, well, see, we should never kill an animal. Well, I guess Leviticus was just one big blot on God's record, right? Where he's just killing and slaying animals all the way through that thing. And so you can't just pull stuff out and just be like, well, this is my diet right here. Especially in the New Testament, when you see that, everything, is, we can eat anything with prayer and all that stuff. But I'm not saying beans and lentils aren't good for you, because they are, okay? But only that. How about give us this day our daily bread, okay? And I'm all for protein diets. And listen, I do, when I diet and stuff like that and try to lose weight, I'll try to do like the Atkins or even the keto diet and all these different things. I'm not against that type of stuff, but, don't tell me that bread is bad, okay? When the Bible talks about that bread is, give us this day our daily bread. Jesus is the bread of life, So bread and water, I'm pretty sure is good. But don't take this stuff too far. Now, if you want to fast and do this, like the Daniel fast, as they would call it, I guess, and you want to just eat lentils for 10 days, go for it. I'm not against you, but again, I believe it was a miracle that was performed there. But in verse 17, again, we see that these are children. I wanted to point that out because Daniel's for this whole 70 years, meaning that it's not unprecedented. It's not crazy that he would have made it through the whole captivity, because 70 years, if you went in there as an infant, you'd be 70 years old when you came out. So he was probably like in his 80s, right? Let's say he was 10 years old. He was 80 years old when he came out of captivity. So we're not dealing with just a grown man coming into captivity, because then he'd be really old. right? He'd be like 100 years old if he was like a 30-year-old man coming in there. So they're children. And in verse 14 is, in verse 17 it says, "And as for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams." So all the children had knowledge and skill and wisdom, and you think about the science, it talked about the understanding science, that's who they were looking for. And God gave them all this knowledge and everything for them. But Daniel's the one that had the knowledge and the visions and the dreams, okay? And in this case, we're going to see in chapter 2 is something that's unprecedented, which he not only interprets a dream, but he tells them what the dream was without anybody telling them. Okay, so Joseph is kind of the other person. If you think of 2 people in the Bible that can interpret dreams, is Joseph and Daniel. Okay, and we obviously saw all those dreams that Joseph would interpret in Genesis, but we'll see with Daniel even more so. But when he brings them forth to Nebuchadnezzar, he finds them better than anybody else in his kingdom. Okay, so these are very intelligent children, and obviously as they grew up, they became just men. But in verse 18 it says, "Now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them in, then the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king communed with them, and among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore stood they before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in all his realm." 10 times better. That's huge. And so, but that starts off with Daniel purposing in his heart that he would not eat the king's meat. And God blessed that. And so you got to understand that's at a young age too. And it talks about blessed is the man that beareth his yoke, or beareth the yoke in his youth. And you have to purpose this in your heart at a very young age. And listen, if you're older, you need to purpose it in your heart now, but don't wait until you're older, okay? Because God blesses Daniel, and later on, those blessings of him understanding visions and dreams is going to save his life and his friends' lives. But I wanted to just talk about Daniel, God's view on Daniel, and why I like Daniel so much, or why I like the book of Daniel, because Daniel was a very righteous man. Okay, the Bible is very clear to explain. It's good at Ezekiel chapter 14. Ezekiel chapter 14. So Daniel's a very good person to look at as far as to try to emulate. If you had a hero in the Bible, so to speak, Daniel should probably be up there on the list as far as someone that I would want to emulate. One thing I didn't mention, it doesn't say that Daniel's a eunuch, okay? It never says that they made these children eunuchs. It says that Ashkenaz was the prince of the eunuchs, but just because someone's the prince of the eunuchs doesn't mean that that's who they made all these people into eunuchs, okay? And so, not to get graphic into what a eunuch is, but a eunuch can also just be the fact that they don't marry and have children, okay? It doesn't mean that they're necessarily mutilated, but it doesn't say that Daniel's a eunuch. And that's one thing I just want to point out. Maybe he was, okay? I'm not saying that he wasn't, but you'd have to infer that just because the person that's over him is the prince of the eunuchs, okay? And I personally don't believe necessarily he's a eunuch. But I don't see where he married either. So maybe he was a eunuch in the fact that he just didn't marry, and he was, served the king as a single person, and that's why he was a eunuch. Okay, so nowhere does it say that they made them eunuchs, or that he was even called a eunuch. It's not like the Ethiopian eunuch, right? Where that's in his name, or that's like part of his title. But I just wanted to mention that. That's just my thoughts on that. But Ezekiel chapter 14 verse 12, it says this. It says, "The word of the Lord came again to me, saying, Son of man, when the land sinneth against me by trespassing it grievously, then will I stretch out mine hand upon it, and will break the staff of the bread thereof, and will send famine upon it, and will cut off man and beast from it. Though these 3 men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in it, they should deliver but their own souls by their righteousness, saith the Lord God." So he's talking about saying, hey, listen, if you sin in the land grievously, then the only people that I would ever even save out of this land is Noah, Daniel, and Job. Okay? Now, all these men are dead at this point when he's speaking to, when he's prophesying, and Ezekiel's prophesying this. But he's basically saying, I would only save them because of their righteousness. That's intense. And that shows you that top 3 as far as righteous men. And you can understand why Job would be in there. He was a just man upon the whole earth in his day, right? And Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, and him and his family are the only ones that were saved out of, when they flooded the whole earth. So you can see, but Daniel's mentioned in there, okay? And he not only mentions, he mentions that there, which is an amazing passage. It just always caught my ear, my eye when I'm reading it. But notice in verse 19, he says it again. In verse 19 it says, or if I send a pestilence into the land and pour out my fury upon it in blood to cut off from it man and beast, though Noah, Daniel, and Job were in it, as I live, saith the Lord God, they shall deliver neither son nor daughter. They shall but deliver their own souls by their righteousness. So why would they be delivered? For their righteousness. Daniel was a very righteous man. And so it's from his youth. He was a child when he was taken into captivity. Imagine being taken captive as a child and staying strong with the Lord. And purposing in your heart that you're not going to take of the king's meat. When it's basically, you imagine that they're getting put into this position. It's basically like, here's the silver platter. Take whatever you want. And then saying, no, I'm going to follow the Lord. And I'm not going to give myself to this appetite. I'm not going to be assimilated to your society in the way that you want me to be assimilated. And it's also a good picture, too, as far as how we're in this world, but not to be of this world. Meaning that Daniel did great things in Babylon while he was there. And did great things for the cause of Christ, to where people were believing on God because of it, and proclamations were going out to serve the Lord God of the Bible. And but he didn't become a part of their religion. Okay? And that's where we're at, right? We have to work. We have to be a part of the society as far as, like, we have to live in it. We have to go to the stores. We have to be around the people. We're not going on some convent over here. We have to be, we have to go out into the world and preach the gospel to every creature, but we don't have to be of them. We're in the world, but we're not of the world. And that's Daniel. Daniel was in Babylon, but he wasn't of Babylon. And he kept his integrity throughout the whole book of Daniel. But also, you think of Daniel as being a very righteous man. So when you look at the first part of this, you're going to deal with the first part of Daniel, you're dealing with the fact that he's a very righteous man. His friends are very righteous. And, he had a good set of friends. And, they stuck to their guns. They did great things for God. But then the other half of the picture is that Daniel is very pivotal to end times prophecy. Go to Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24. Jesus particularly says, look to Daniel the prophet, for a very pivotal point in end times prophecy. And so Matthew chapter 24 and verse 15, and we'll get into that. I'm not getting into any end times prophecy tonight because this is just chapter 1, but we will get into that. Chapter 2 is going to have it in it, and chapter 3, guess what's going to have it in it. So there's going to be a lot of end times prophecy, even inside the stories of what they went through in their life. But in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 15 it says, and when ye therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. So he's saying, look back to that. He's calling you back. And, it usually says, as it is written, and you'd be like, okay, I need to go see what was written back there. He literally says, whoso readeth, let him understand. He's saying, go read it. Go read Daniel the prophet, because this is what's going on here. And you see the abomination of desolation. That's what the turning point, and that's when you know you're in the end times. And notice in verse 16 it says, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day, for then shall be a great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there shall no flesh should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days should be shortened. So what is this abomination of desolation? What does that mark? When the Great Tribulation starts. And, we'll get into the beginning of sorrows, but the abomination of desolation is in the midst of that week, of that 7-year period where the Great Tribulation starts. Daniel is that pivotal moment in that book that's pointing you back to that, the abomination of desolation. That's where it's mentioned in the book of Daniel, and we will get to that, but it's very interesting. And Mark 13 says the same thing. It says in verse 14, it says, "But when ye shall see the abomination of desolation spoken by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not, let him that readeth understand." And so it's very pivotal in the fact of end times prophecy, but it's also a very good book just on looking at a righteous man and a stance that he took in a foreign land. And aren't we in a foreign land? Listen, I'm an American citizen, but aren't we pilgrims and strangers in this world? And are we really free when we pay more than 50% of our taxes? You know what I mean? And when it comes to that, I mean, is this really our land? The property that I own, do I really own it when I have to pay property tax on it and all this stuff? And you really think about all this stuff, we are pretty much we're in Babylon. This is Babylon, USA, by the way. It very much pertains to us when we think of Daniel and his friends being in Babylon and going through the persecutions that they're going through, and the society saying to bow down to whatever image we set before you, and dealing with wicked rulers and dealing with all that. But God can bring you through that. God can make it to where his word is published throughout the whole world. And right before it talks about the abomination of desolation, it says that the gospel shall be published throughout the whole world. And one of the things I love about the book of Daniel is the fact that it talks about that. It talks about how even through all that persecution, there's going to be people preaching. There's going to be people purifying people, making them white, meaning that they're getting them saved. And some are going to fall by the sword, but they're going to do it anyway. And so it's such a great book. But those are the two things what I see. I see a righteous man, Daniel, and his friends. But I also see a very pivotal book dealing with end times prophecy. And, I think it's going to be a fun study. And so, but this is really kind of the introduction into that. When we get into chapter 2, we're going to start diving into it, even with just the image and all that. So there's a lot of fun stories that we're going to be getting into, but a lot of fun end times prophecy as well as we get into that. So let's end with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this afternoon, and just thank you for the souls that were saved today and this past week. And Lord, just pray that you would bless our church and just help us to bring glory to your name. And Lord, just help us to do your work. But Lord, we just pray that you would help us to understand your word. Help us to understand all the deep truths of the Bible, but ultimately so that we be edified to do more for you and to bring glory to your name. And Lord, we love you and pray in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.